Now, we're going to bring you some Gary Breen goodness in just a moment. If anybody has any questions for Gary, now would be a great time to get them in at Off The Ball on Twitter or facebook.com/Off The Ball. So here's the footage of Jose Mourinho talking about Paul Scholes yesterday evening. We're going to talk about this right now.
I think the only thing Paul Scholes does is to criticize. I don't think he comments. I think he criticizes, which is a different thing. But you know, not every one of us has to be phenomenal like he was as a player. He was a phenomenal player. That doesn't mean that we all have to be phenomenal. Paul tries to do his best all the time, and sometimes he plays very well, sometimes he plays well, and sometimes he doesn't play so well. You know, it's not Paul's fault that he made much more money than Paul Scholes. It's not Pogba's fault. It's just the way football is. But I think Scholes will be in the history like a phenomenal player, not as a pundit. So I prefer to look at him as a phenomenal player that gave so much to the club that I am proud to represent and to give my humble contribution every day. Every day I try to do my best. If Paul one day decides to be a manager, I wish that he can be 25% as successful as myself, because 25%, so 50% is 12.5 silverware, 25% is around 6. If he's 25%, you'll be quite happy. But in my mind, Paul Scholes, phenomenal player, one of the best players I have ever seen playing in midfield, and he gave so much to my club that I only can thank him for that, because the prestige of this club is based on people like him.
Gary Breen, Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, guys.
How do you think Paul Scholes is going to respond to the jibes about him being a little bit jealous of the money that Paul Pogba has earned? And, you know, if he's a quarter the manager that I am, well, then he'll be doing pretty well.
Yeah, listen, I have no doubt Paul Scholes is not struggling for a pound note or two. There's no doubt about that. But it's a strange thing to bring up, the money scenario. I think Jose Mourinho doesn't like criticism. I think the way he's worded that, he's very quick to acknowledge how highly thought of Paul Scholes is in Manchester United fans' views and the history of the club. But I think he's got his message across straight away, that he's telling Paul Scholes, you've never managed, so why are you commenting on that? And the issue he probably has is that he's talking about Paul Scholes being negative all the time. Well, at times this season, it has been frustrating to be a Manchester United supporter in terms of what's happening across the city. So you can understand the frustration there, but Jose Mourinho doesn't seem to be handling it particularly well.
Part of me, so I went back and watched exactly what Scholes had said, and you know, Scholes has actually developed a bit of a reputation as being quite negative, but also being quite straightforward. This wasn't particularly negative. This was just saying that Pogba was a better player at Juventus because he had Andrea Pirlo beside him, and actually he also seemed to be a little bit fitter at the time. Now, there are some questions about whether or not Pogba has been living his life right off the field over the last year or so, but he's had some difficulties in his personal life, and that seems to have been one of the main reasons why there was a bit of distraction for him. I think that maybe Mourinho is pissed off because Paul Scholes is right.
Well, I'm sure Mourinho's frustrated by the fact that, and talking about fitness issues, the fact that Pogba got injured, and he was quite vocal about that he shouldn't have got injured, that he played a game when he had a little bit of a tight hamstring, and as a result, then he missed a big chunk and some vital games. But you're right, in terms of what Paul Scholes has said, I think what player isn't better having someone like Pirlo next to him? And certainly, when you think of Pogba playing for Juventus, it was in a 3, it was on that left-hand side. And for the first time, it seemed like he was playing that role yesterday, where he was just drifting to left-hand side of midfield, finding space and creating from there. And he looked back to his best. He was the one that made the difference in that second half. Certainly, Manchester United were finding it difficult to break him down. But that quality pass, that weighted pass in field there to Martial to get the opening goal, and then Manchester United just went on from there. But listen, the frustration obviously comes in terms of what Paul Scholes has said, but I think it's a accumulation of things in terms of the fact that what Pep Guardiola is doing at City, the frustrations that Mourinho has in trying to keep up with him. He's struggling. He's saying a comment every other week, it seems, in terms of the money, that he hasn't had enough money, which is a ridiculous statement. The fact that they've been unlucky, that the footballing gods are looking down on City. It never, ever seems to be Mourinho's fault as such. And when people do start questioning his ability as a manager, which in terms of what he's done over his career, you cannot question him. But if they're looking at him right now, and is he performing to stay with the likes of Guardiola, then he obviously is finding it difficult to answer questions about that in itself.
Do you think we've reached peak pundit at this point, Gary? Do you think that the cult of the pundit is just too large? Like, we've got Jose Mourinho here constantly wanting to leave a mark on anybody on television who says something about him. We look at Arsene Wenger even hitting out at Thierry Henry this week after he criticised the Arsenal players for not going to celebrate with Sanchez. And then suddenly, after his comments, all the players go and celebrate with Sanchez after his goal against West Brom. So suddenly, the pundit is just as important as anybody else inside the team or any comments from the staff. That literally, if you say it on BT Sport or you say it on Sky Sports, that is as much rocket fuel for these players to come back with hit back quotes, if you like. Yeah, no, absolutely. Listen, it's the way that the supporters are getting a lot of their views in terms of listening to iconic players, certainly who are attributed to a particular club. So if Henry's talking about Arsenal, those supporters are going to listen. Paul Scholes, likewise, at Manchester United, and Carragher, these type of guys are opinionated. They've been very successful. And these managers are under a microscope now, like never before, in terms of iconic players, top players who are quite good in terms of breaking down the game, dissecting it and saying, listen, this is not quite right. They're not right all the time. And you have to, and you're quite right, Jed, to say about Paul Scholes. He says a lot of stuff just to create a little bit of a headline. It's incredible, really, because we couldn't get a word out of him while he was playing. But the managers don't like it. They don't like to be questioned. And I think their mindset also is, listen, it's all right saying this in a studio, but you come and do what we're doing, and that's something that they should do. I think any manager, if he's being criticised by the likes of Gary Neville now, can turn around and say, well, hold on, I don't remember England playing particularly well, I don't remember Valencia performing particularly well. So, and you can notice it with Gary Neville, he's toned it down a little bit, and he's trying to be a bit more in terms of breaking down situations rather than just giving sweeping comments like the likes of Scholes and these other guys who haven't coached. So is this classic Mourinho just getting back and distracting from the fact that maybe he made a bit of a boo-boo when he talked about the money? Because certainly the response when he did talk about the money was overwhelming. Everybody called him a hypocrite and started to point to the evidence and the facts, and basically he was talking nonsense. This week we're all talking about this, as opposed to the excellent performance, and also the fact that maybe Pogba did actually play in that role and he listened a little bit to what Scholes had said or responded to it. So this was about, like, actually, I'm right, I'm the boss. What's the motivation here, do you think? Well, in terms of Pogba, I'm sure that he holds Paul Scholes in like high regard, being a young player coming through United, seeing what that guy was doing on the training field. So I'm sure if he does say something, and it's a positive criticism, I'm sure he will take it on board. But Mourinho is a manager, there's no doubt about that. And he always creates a siege mentality, doesn't he? I'm sure he's gone into that dressing room and said, listen, all these guys are criticising us, let's show them and stuff like that. But the frustration for Mourinho must be the fact that, and we've seen it from Manchester United over this Christmas period, they have actually dominated games, created chances. But the player that he normally has in his team, top goal scorers like a Drogba, those type of guys, or Ronaldo at Real Madrid, they just don't take their chances as much as they created. And when you look at the Southampton game, it just reminds you of last season where they just couldn't break down these teams and it cost them so many points. And I think that's where the real frustration is coming from Mourinho. But when you do listen to him, Jerry, and you listen, it kind of gets you down listening to him now, because when he is at his charming best, he's brilliant to listen to. But he just seems so dour at the moment, as if the whole world is against him. And it's not that way, because he has been successful in terms of coming into Manchester United last season. I think the belief was that the second season, United would be challenging a lot stronger than they have been. But they've just come up against an incredible team. And it doesn't happen. It doesn't help the fact that they're Manchester rivals. It doesn't help the fact that it's Guardiola, who always seems to be his main rival in terms of Mourinho not getting the credit he deserves, because he looks at Guardiola and what he's doing and the way he's doing it, and he just doesn't enjoy seeing the plaudits that he gets. We were just making the point a little bit earlier on, fast forward to New Year's Day next year, and I think it's 50-50 whether or not Jose Mourinho is still the Manchester United manager, especially if Man City start the season next year the way it looks like they're going to finish this year. Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think
what would concern me, certainly, if you're a United fan who wants to keep Mourinho, is he keeps referencing PSG, the money that they've got. And Mourinho will look at that and think, listen, I want to be successful. He thinks he's turned up in an iconic club like Manchester United, but they don't have the financial muscle that they've had in previous years. They can't compete against those type of guys. So I think he will look at that scenario. I think he's caught in it in terms of saying, well, listen, come to me, make an offer, and we'll see how it goes. But I would agree with you guys. I wouldn't be convinced that he's going to be a long-term appointment at United. But everyone said that initially. But I think the main thought was that he would win trophies and then go. It doesn't seem that he'd be able to do that with the Manchester City's type of form.
Yeah, it's ironic really then when you look at Jesse Lingard in the middle of all of this, that suddenly there's a player within the ranks who's made this jump, as Jose referred to it as. He says some boys make the jump, some boys don't. Lingard has made that jump very visibly, and there's no question now after his form in November, December and into the start of the new year. What's that down to, Gary?
Probably a lot of belief from the player himself. He's took his opportunity, and that's a good thing for Mourinho, that someone like him has developed and kicked on, because everyone's looking at what Guardiola has done, not just in terms of the money that he's spent, but how he has improved the squad that he inherited. That, like the likes of De Bruyne, even Silva, Otamendi, they've gone to a completely different level. Every one of that squad has, to be perfectly honest. So I think it's good, because I think a lot of people will look at United and probably use it as a stick to beat Mourinho, to say, listen, he's not developing these players. They're not getting any better. Lukaku, as such, hasn't kicked on like you would expect him to, bearing in mind he's leading the line for Manchester United. So Lingard is certainly a plus for Mourinho, and he has to continue that.
Let's move on. I just want to play a clip here of Pat Nevin talking about how he's getting a bit bored of the fact that everybody who comes up against Manchester City ends up playing really defensively against them. Have a look.
I'm a bit fed up with it. I'm really fed up with it. I was about 3 weeks ago, I don't know if you remember, Man City played against Huddersfield, and then Chelsea went up to Huddersfield as well, and I was at the game, and Huddersfield never made an effort to get out of their back line, very much like Newcastle. Watched Southampton doing the same recently as well. Watched Everton doing exactly the same. Liverpool managed to sneak away and get the penalty that day, but totally undeservedly, and that's coming from a blue. When I played, I managed to play just about 850 games in my career, and I can only ever remember two teams not making an attempt to attack, and that was San Marino and Luxembourg. Everybody else domestically had a go, and we were playing against good teams in those days. I mean, Liverpool were one of the best, if not the best, club team in Europe. You know what? Whether it was playing for Chelsea or Everton or whatever, we had a go. At some point, you certainly would never lined up in that way where you sat in the back line, you lumped it forward, and you waited for the next attack.
Even teams that were in the relegation zone, even teams that were 17th, 18th, 19th in the First Division table, when they were going away to Anfield, they wouldn't just sit back.
Do you know what? See teams in the third and fourth tiers of English football, they have a go. They have more of a go than that when it's a cup game. That's the way it is. That's the way British and stroke English football has always been. Now, you may have to defend for periods, but you will at some point have a go. We'll have the belief to break out now and again. It might only be with 3 or 4 or 5 players, but you will have it in your armoury to have a go, because it's, now and again it works for you. Now, if we get into the habit, and it is becoming a real habit, and I've not seen this in the British game, in the English game, really basically ever before. This is the worst, white flag I've ever seen from a group of teams. Now, just when I was getting very annoyed about it the other day there, suddenly one or two teams decided, well, we'll have a little bit of a go. Palace had a little bit of a go at Manchester City. West Brom had a little bit of a go at Arsenal. So maybe it's not all, nightmares and disasters, but Stoke City turning up at Chelsea and Mark Hughes saying, I understood his argument, it made a lot of sense. But even if you leave a lot of players out, don't bring all these other guys in and tell them not to attack.
Yeah, I think that's the key point there. The Stoke City example at the end is the perfect end of that. So Mark Hughes basically picks a B team and says, if it was still close at half time, I was going to bring on all the subs and get a bit more experience on in the second half, and I was saving the team for Newcastle, and then ultimately they end up losing both games. Like, it did feel for a while in the Premier League like even the bad teams had enough really good players on them in the squads that they could go to Chelsea and cause a bit of a trouble.
Yeah, listen, you talk about bad Premier League teams. I played in a couple of them myself, and you're right. you'd obviously be up against it in terms of the top teams, but you would go after them. Of course you would. I remember for Coventry, we would have had the likes of Gary McAllister, Robbie Keane, and we beat Arsenal. They're a very good team at the time. But I think we beat United as well at home at Coventry when that might have been the year that they won the treble. So we went after them. And, you quite often you're found wanting, but still it wasn't be a negative. But I agree with a lot with what Pat says there. And he's a purist, Pat. You have to remember that. He's about total football. And at times, I think the likes of Wenger, Guardiola, certainly Klopp to an extent last year when he was talking about playing against West Brom, couldn't understand why teams were playing certain ways against them. Well, you have to have a reality check. The likes of Wenger always wants people to take Arsenal at football. It doesn't work like that. Big Sam used to ruin him in the Premier League years with Bolton in terms of that physicality. So there is that. But you're right. I think the performance of Newcastle in that first half suggests that it's already putting up a good defensive performance, and Bournemouth had done it a couple of days earlier for half an hour, really good. But anytime they won the ball and forced a turnover, they're looking to play Callum Wilson at pace down the channels and expose the fact that City's fullbacks have gone in advanced areas. Newcastle never looked like doing that. That was the problem. They just tried to stay in the game. But I would agree as well, what Stoke did recently at Chelsea, just that beggars belief, really. And his comments for an experienced manager to say, listen, we're just putting all our eggs in one basket for Newcastle. And I think the general consensus of football supporters were delighted to see them lose that game, because you can't give up a game like that. You have to put a challenge in. And they were 3-0 down after 20 minutes. And you have to argue that message came from the manager before those players even stepped on the pitch. So they literally were told, listen, we've got no chance here. So let's just get it over with. Let's get on the bus back home.
Because ultimately he's telling as well a bunch of players just to sit it out for the day, because we've seen West Brom put in an official complaint about the build-up of fixtures, but really when you talk to a lot of players, there's a certain sense of enjoyment, particularly after they've retired, and kind of a wistful remembrance of just a game after game after game around Christmas. Yeah. And essentially you're out there playing football, and essentially Mark Hughes is like, right, these guys are sick of this is the worst possible time for this to happen, and he's clearly waving the white flag on behalf of the players.
Yeah, well, listen, you're right there, because I'm sick of listening to these players talking about they can't play. That's part of the challenge of the Premier League, is that you have certain games and you get yourself in physical condition that over the winter period, you're able to play the short amount of loads of games in a short amount of time. And that's the challenge. That's why it's so unique, the Premier League. And what you have is these sports scientists have grabbed hold of the football and they keep telling players, you can't do it. You can do it. Maybe you can't play, but it's an endurance-based league. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon as such, and that's one of the challenges. And when they keep saying that they can't do it, it's a nonsense. And I know they'll put the stats out, but they feel when I was coaching at Peterborough, even at that level, the sports science was coming in as if they invented the game. It is so frustrating.
Just going back to that Manchester City talking point a moment ago, is there something in that Crystal Palace performance that we can take and that other teams can take for the rest of the season, that you don't have to be gung-ho to create opportunities against Manchester City, but if you've got a good target man who can hold up the ball with two speedy wingers either side of him, you've got a very good chance of causing Manchester City some sort of problem. Of course, the resorting to the kicking is not something that people should be looking to, but teams are going to try it again, no doubt. Yeah,
well, even in terms of how that game developed, though, City had loads of chances, so it could quite comfortably be a 3-0, 4-0, but Palace stayed in the game. That's the difference. They managed not to concede a goal in the first half and then took it to the last 15 minutes, where any football game can go anyway then. But when you look at the way people say about adopting a negative attitude against Manchester City, Manchester United did. They didn't go toe-to-toe with them this season. They tried it last year and got mauled. And Tottenham are the only ones over the last couple of seasons, prior to this game where they played and got beaten 4-1, they took 10 points from 4 games from Manchester City with a high press. But all of a sudden now this season, Manchester City have Ederson. So if you press high, he's pinging the ball to the centre forwards. And suddenly Tottenham had 4 people out of the game. So you can't do it. So it's all well and good everyone being negative about the lesser teams and saying, they're not taking them on. The top teams are not taking them on.
One of the other things there, the point about the kicking, obviously lots of complaints about the various challenges in that that City suffered, particularly the De Bruyne and Jesus injuries. Looks like De Bruyne is actually not going to be as badly injured as maybe was first feared, and Jesus is going to be out for a couple of months. There will be a ramping up of the physicality that Manchester City just have to get used to from the other teams. And it's funny, we haven't actually seen that much of it so far. Is this a template and nobody's called it?
Yeah, we have. Everyone's talking about that punch and tackle. That's him just trying to stop a counter attack. It looks bad. But go back to Harry Kane's tackle on Sterling, it's disgusting. Go back to Ali's tackle on De Bruyne, they're dreadful. And because they're the media darlings, Harry Kane, nothing really been made of it. Go and watch them tackles. They are horrendous. Jacob Murphy as well done it to De Bruyne in the Newcastle game where he's led and stamped down. And they're the type of tackles. And I agree 100% with Pep Guardiola, because I've been in teams where you try and even it up by having a bit of physicality about it. But there's a difference between crashing into people and making career-threatening tackles. And we've seen the likes of Ashley Young. We've seen other guys now getting 3-match bans, the likes of Tarkowski at Burnley, just for little off-the-ball incidents. But there's no retrospective actions for those type of tackles that ultimately will end the player's career. I've seen it. I had young Colin Healy at Sunderland with us, who had a massive future ahead of him for Ireland. He had his leg broken in a stamp-down challenge in the game against Coventry. He never really hit the heights after that. So I agree 100% with Guardiola. The type of tackles that have gone in have been shocking against Manchester City.
Okay, so, right, there has already been a campaign, you think, from...
Yeah, listen, Guardiola... Well, it's a natural thought process is that you can't take them on football. So you want to enforce your physicality on them and stuff like that. But there's a fine line between that. I mean, I was quite a physical player. I was into that and I enjoyed all that. But there's a difference between that stamped down challenge that breaks people's legs. And I've seen too much of it in the last 5 or 6 weeks against Manchester City. Those tackles that I named. And listen, Harry Kane, I mean, I'm a massive fan of Harry Kane's and he's broke this Alan Shearer record. It's incredible. But the reality is he shouldn't have had the opportunity. He should have had a 3-match ban for that tackle because that was horrendous.
A problem with that as well, though, Gary, is that a lot of these challenges, and I think the Harry Kane one included, if I recall correctly, was just given as a yellow card. And this rule about once the action has been taken, we don't want to embarrass the referee. It's a joke, really, isn't it? It's
an absolute nonsense because for that very reason, I never want to see the physical aspect taken out of the game. I never want it to see the way Wenger wants it to be total football. I don't want to see that. And invariably, when you go to Arsenal, as much as the brilliant football they've seen, you get a massive reaction from the crowds when they just make tackles, those Arsenal players. So I want to protect that part of the Premier League because it's a brilliant viewing point to see the physicality of it. But some of the tackles, as you rightly said, and that is the biggest nonsense, that retrospective action, because just because you've been booked is irrelevant. That is what the referee saw on that split moment. He decides it's a yellow. But as soon as he goes back and sees that video footage, if he'd have seen it in that context, there's no doubt he'd have done a 3-match ban straight away. And they have to address that.
Surely they can fix that. It's as easy as that, as let the referee relitigate it when he actually has a look at it. Got to talk to you about Virgil van Dijk and his arrival at Liverpool. Obviously, the two centre-backs combined to score a late winner against Burnley. Almost like competition has immediately improved their performances. Is this a great signing for Liverpool, and will they actually get the best from Van Dijk if they continue with the way that they've set their team up so far this season and last under Klopp?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant signing. My only concern was it the Van Dijk that we've seen this season? And I looked at the scenario and is the fact that he really was poor at Southampton. And even Klopp said he's had a bad first half of the season. I think that might be a case of recovering from his long-term knee injury, a bit of a loss of focus, or ultimately a poor attitude in the fact that he was literally down tools. But certainly, if I was to identify it as a remit for a centre-half to play in Klopp's Liverpool team, it's him. It's the fact that we talked about the lesser teams just going long against Liverpool to miss out that high press. So you need a commanding physical presence. He's that. You talk about a centre-half who's comfortable being dragged into full-back positions because Liverpool like to get those full-backs in advanced positions. He's comfortable doing that, as top modern centre-halves have to be. He's good on the ball. He's a physical presence at set pieces. So he ticks all those boxes. The only concern I would say is that people are billing him as a leader. I don't think he's that. I think he will lead more through his own personal performances as opposed to cajoling, getting people around him, dominating a vocal player like a Jamie Carragher. I don't think he's that, but I think it's a brilliant signing. And the only concern is that he has to hit the ground running, because the way that Liverpool have handled this situation, the fact that they pay him £25 million more than they did in the summer, it's been a complete mess. They got reported for an illegal approach. Whoever the hierarchy was in doing that deal has made a complete mess of it. So it puts massive pressure not only on Van Dijk to justify his fee, but also the Liverpool board, but also Klopp, for the very fact he's put all his eggs in one basket to say, and I agreed with that at the time, that he didn't want to go and get a lesser centre-half. He wanted to get Van Dijk. But it does bode well for Liverpool. Keita's coming in the summer. I know Coutinho probably looks like he's going, but Lallana's coming back in from injury. It really looks good for Liverpool, and I expect them to really challenge now to be the best of the rest, because obviously City have run away with the league this season.
Do you subscribe to the idea, Gary, that I think it was Aidan O'Hara making the point in the Irish Independent yesterday, that Van Dijk's reputation has been based on his performances against the top six in that Southampton season 2 years ago, I think, whenever they finished sixth, that potentially we watched a lot of his games in full on a Sunday when they're playing against the big teams, and like the facts show that Southampton just weren't as good, or Van Dijk wasn't putting in these barnstorming performances as much against lesser opposition. Obviously that's going to happen a lot more against Liverpool when they're going to have a bit more of the ball. That potentially just not having as much possession against the big teams in Southampton, which is when he was in the limelight, was essentially what Van Dijk has been signed for, and there might be another side to him that potentially even Jurgen Klopp himself isn't even aware of.
Well, there is a weakness, and you're right to point that out, Owen. And ultimately, it boils down to the fact that his lack of concentration. That's the weakness in his game. That when it's easy, he switches off. Even his coaches in said that the game, he's so talented, but he just gets into bad habits. And he certainly had when he came down from Celtic in terms of how dominant Celtic would be on the ball up in the Scottish League. So when he came down to the Premiership initially, he'd take too long to get into good defensive positions because he felt that they'd keep the ball. In the Premier League, you're going to be opened up as soon as you don't get into early positions. But I think he will improve. I think Klopp will probably identify that. And I just feel that he is the perfect centre-half to play for Klopp's system in terms of his pace. He's good on the ball. And a lot of the teams now will sit deep against Liverpool because they don't want any space in behind for the likes of Mane, Salah. So that invariably means that centre-halves will get a lot of ball. They might often be playmakers. And when he does step into midfield, he can break lines, he can hit good diagonal passes. But even if he gets within shooting range, he's got a great strike on him. So I am hoping that he is the type of centre-half who will fulfil his potential, and he'll have to be. But if he can do, then I think they've got a brilliant signing.
Gary, great stuff. Happy New Year to you.
And to you guys, thank you.
Thanks a million. It's Gary Breen with us there on Skype this morning.